What is going on, chess YouTube? In today's video, we're looking at the incredible game Arjun Erigaisi versus Magnus Carlsen from the 2024 Fide World Rapid and Team Championships. And yes, in this game, Magnus does play an Alpha Zero inspired attack, and this game took place on August 1st, 2024. And here we go. In the game, Arjun opens 1e4 best by test, and Magnus does go 1e5. Then we have knight to f3, knight to c6, and here on move 3, Arjun does opt for the Ruy Lopez opening with the move 3, bishop b5. And the main idea of this opening, you are putting pressure on that knight on c6, and you are setting up short castles in the near future. Now here, Black has two main ways to respond. The first one is the older move a6, and the second one is the newer move knight to f6, the Berlin defense. Now, Magnus Carlsen is a big fan of the martial attack, starting with the move 3, a6. However, instead, in this game, he does go 3, knight to f6, the Berlin defense, a favorite of Vladmir Kramnik. Now, the idea is you are putting pressure on that pawn on e4 right away, and White's going to have two main responses. The first one is for d3, defending the pawn on e4 with the pawn, and the other one is simply for short castles. Now, in the game, Arjun, he does go for d3, opting to defend with the pawn, and now here, Magnus Carlsen, the main move for him as Black, of course, is going to be for bishop c5, the Italian opening style move. The idea being you get that bishop outside the pawn chain, then go d6, then short castles, and overall, you will have a very solid game. Now, instead of that, in this game, Magnus, he does go for d6, blocking in that bishop on f8. And what's the idea? Well, here he wants to go bishop e7 and short castles, and yes, that bishop will be a little bit more passive on the e7 square. However, overall, Magnus Carlsen does believe he will have a very solid position. Now here, Arjun, short castles is the move, a very standard idea in the Ruy Lopez. And now here, the main move for Black, believe it or not, is going to be a6, putting the pressure on that bishop. And then from there, the main line for White, of course, is bishop takes c6, doubling Black's pawns. And after b takes c6, we would have a very imbalanced game. Black would have double pawns, but he would also have that bishop pair, those b's on c8 and f8, and that would give him decent long-term chances. Now, instead of a6 in this game, Magnus does go bishop e7, a solid move, intending short castles, but overall, Arjun will have a very solid advantage here if he wants it. Now here, the main line for White, of course, is c3, the typical Ruy Lopez / Italian opening style move. However, instead, Arjun, if you follow this man's games, you know Arjun is a madman at the chessboard. He is very, very aggressive. So with that in mind, he finds a more aggressive idea in this position. He simply breaks in the center with the move 6d4, immediately gaining space and threatening d5 on the next move. Of course, that knight on c6 is being pinned to the king. Therefore, d5 would threaten to win the knight immediately. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, what should he be doing about this threat? Well, there are a couple of ways to deal with it. You can go, for example, a6 right away, bishop d7 blocking the pin, even e takes d4 is playable. But instead, Magnus, he finds the strongest move in this position. That is simply 6 castles, ignoring the threat of d5. And here's why. In the game, Arjun, he does go d5. d5 is the strongest move and most combative idea here. However, Magnus Carlsen, first of all, his knight on c6 is not pinned, therefore it can move. However, instead of going, say, knight to b4 or knight b8 and so on, in the game, Magnus Carlsen, he does go a6, driving back that bishop on b5. Now, if Arjun does play the move d takes c6, then a takes b5 will win back the piece immediately, and Magnus would have a massive advantage in that position, as White's pawn on e4 would be incredibly weak, and Black would have excellent development. Now, instead of that, in the game, Arjun, he does opt to retreat the bishop, but where should the bishop go? Well, first of all, bishop a4 is not a very good idea. If you go there, then the sequence for Black is b5, bishop b3, then knight to a5, and you are going to win that Ruy Lopez bishop on b3. That would be very, very good for Black. Black would have an outstanding game, maybe even the better position. Now, instead of that, White does have to go back on this diagonal, and it turns out c4, d3, and e2 are all decent squares for the bishop, but in the game, Arjun does find the best square. That is simply bishop to e2. Now, again, the problem with c4, for example, Black can go b5, and the problem with d3 is Black can go knight to b4, once again putting pressure on that bishop with the knight. Therefore, with that in mind, e2 is the best square here. Now, in the game, Magnus, his knight on c6 is being attacked. Where should that knight go? In the game, Magnus goes knight to b8, a typical retreating move for the knight in the Ruy Lopez, and now here Black may be intending, for example, knight d7, and then maybe knight to c5 in the future. Now here, Arjun, his pawn on e4 is being attacked. Of course, you do have to defend, but here's the big question. How do you defend that pawn in this position? Well, there aren't many moves. You can go knight to c3, defending with the knight. However, the problem with that move is white does want to push the c-pawn down the board, and knight to c3 immediately does block that c-pawn on the c2 square. Now, knight c3 is still very playable. However, that is a very big drawback of that move. Beyond that, you can go, say, queen d3 or knight to d2. Those moves are also playable. But instead, in the game, Arjun, he moves his bishop yet again, this time going bishop d3, defending the pawn on e4 with the bishop. And the idea being, he wants to go c4, knight to c3, and then start an attack on the queen side in the spirit of the king's Indian defense. All right, now Magnus, knight b d7 is the move, a typical rerouting square for the knight. And now again, his idea may be knight to c5 in the spirit of the king's Indian defense, putting pressure on both that pawn on e4 and that bishop on d3. And how does Arjun want to deal with this threat? Well, the bishop can't move on d3. Of course, if you move the bishop, that pawn on e4 would fall. Therefore, you simply have to allow the idea of knight c5 capturing that bishop on d3. Now, in the game, Arjun has many different playable moves. For example, knight d2, h3, and rook e1 are all playable. But instead, in the game, Arjun does go c4, gaining space on the queen side immediately. Now here, Magnus, he does not hesitate to go knight to c5, putting immediate pressure on that bishop and the pawn on e4. Excellent idea. And now Arjun, he does have to go, say, knight to c3, defending that pawn on e4 with the knight. But this does allow knight takes d3. And here, Magnus, he does just gobble up that bishop. Knight takes, then queen takes is the sequence. And here, as you can see by the eval bar on your left, here Magnus does have a slight advantage in this position, thanks mostly to his bishop pair. Those b's on c8 and e7 are a very powerful asset. Now here, Magnus, it is his turn to move. What should he be doing here? Well, in the spirit of the king's Indian defense, your main plan here is to go f5 as soon as possible. Therefore, with that in mind, here, Magnus, he does retreat the knight, knight to e8, a very simple move, intending f5, and then maybe knight to f6, putting as much pressure on that pawn on e4 as humanly possible. All right, here, Arjun, in the spirit of the king's Indian defense, you do have to get an attack going on the queen side. That is where you have the space advantage, and that is where you are better. Now, Arjun, how should he start the attack? Well, the computer likes the idea of knight to e1 or knight d2, perhaps intending f3 in the future, bolstering the king side, but instead, Arjun, he plays a more aggressive idea, a4, immediately gaining space on the queen side, the idea being potentially a5, then b4, and then either b5 or c5. Now here, Magnus, he's not phased, he's not slowing down, he just goes f5, expanding on the king side with that f-pawn, the key move, and now we have a lot of tension with these pawns on e4 and f5. Both sides will have the option of trading, but who should trade and when? Well, it turns out right here, the best move for Arjun is simply e takes f5. If you don't do that, black will have the option of going f4 at some point in the future, and then intending g5 and g4 with a very strong attack on the king side. You simply cannot allow that. Therefore, e takes f5 is the right move, intending something like bishop takes and then knight to e4, block hitting that e4 square with the knight. Now, instead of that, in the game, Arjun, he does expand on the queen side once again, a5. However, the drawback of this move is black will have the option of going f4 here once again, then g5 and g4. That would be the strongest plan for Magnus. However, instead, in the game, he does keep things a little bit simpler. That option is very double-edged. It's very hard to calculate everything out in advance. Therefore, with that in mind here, Magnus, f takes e4 is the move, a slightly dubious idea in this position, and now Arjun is doing just fine. All right, here, knight takes e4 is the response, and here Magnus does bring out that bishop. Bishop f5 on the board. Of course, Magnus being the only one with a light squared bishop right now, that bishop being very important for putting pressure on that knight on e4. Now here, Arjun, he plays the strongest and most flexible move here. Bishop to e3, a very simple move. The idea being the bishop is very active on e3. If Arjun needs to, he can go knight d2 in the future, and the bishop will be in front of the knight. That is a key idea from the king's Indian defense. And beyond that, white is ready for ideas like b4 and c5, maybe rook a c1, and so on. Now here, Magnus, knight to f6, putting more pressure on that knight on e4, and Arjun does go knight f d2. Again, rerouting those knights to defend e4, and the bishop is in front of the knight. That is a very important detail here, and so far Arjun is coordinating his pieces absolutely perfectly. All right, here, Magnus Carlsen, how does he want to continue the attack on the king side? Well, he has a few different ideas. First of all, you can just trade on e4. For example, knight takes, and then go bishop g5, try to trade off your so-called bad dark squared bishop. That is one idea. You can also go, say, c6, king to h8, or any other number of moves. Instead, in the game, Magnus, he plays a very typical Magnus move. Queen to e8, just sliding the queen over, and the idea being the queen now has access to the king side. For example, queen g6 is a very real threat, putting more pressure on that knight on e4, and Arjun will have to find a good way to deal with this pressure. Now, in the game, Arjun finds a very strong idea. He just trades knights immediately, so with that in mind, knight takes f6 is the move for Arjun, the correct idea. Now here, Magnus, instead of recapturing with the bishop, he actually takes with the rook. Rook takes f6, and now the rook may have access to the king side via the g6 square. All right, Arjun, knight d4, putting pressure on that rook. And now Magnus, believe it or not, is a very big decision. Do you want to go back with the rook, say to f8, allowing queen g6, or do you want to slide over with the rook to the g6 square, the rook lift on the 6th rank? Well, in the game, Magnus does play it safe. He goes rook to f8, intending queen g6 next. A very solid idea. Nothing wrong with that. However, rook g6 was just as playable. That would have been a very interesting idea if Magnus did it in the game. All right, now Arjun, f3 on the board, bolstering that knight on e4. Now the queen is free to move as the knight is defended by the pawn. So solid idea by Arjun. And Magnus, queen g6, again piling up more pressure on that knight on e4. Now here, both sides have pretty much found the best squares for almost all of their pieces, with the possible exception of perhaps the rooks on a8 and the a1 squares. And now this is where the game gets very, very exciting. Here, the only thing left to do for both sides is to push those pawns on the queen side, perhaps b4, then b5, or c5 for Arjun. And then for Magnus, either the alpha 0 attack, h5, h4, h3, or something like h5, queen to h7, then g5, g4, and so on. So both sides pretty much have to go all out right now, attacking with their pawns on opposite sides of the board. All right, Arjun, he starts with the strongest move, b4, gaining space. And now Magnus. Here, the computer likes the idea of this following sequence of moves. Rook f7, rook a to f8, then h5, queen to h7, g5, and then potentially g4, gaining more space on the king side and trying to open up that g-file. Instead, in the game, Magnus, he does go for the alpha 0 inspired attack, starting with the move h5. Very interesting choice. And real fast, if you're not familiar with the term Alpha 0 was a computer engine invented by Google. At one point in 2017, 2018, it was stronger than Stockfish, and it really popularized the idea of pushing your h-pawn all the way down the board, for black all the way to h3, or for white all the way to h6 in a wide variety of positions, and that is now considered an Alpha 0 style attack. All right, here, Magnus, h5 on the board, threatening h4 and h3. Now Arjun, he has to go for it. In the game, he does go b5, gaining more space, trying to open up that b file. And real fast, the computer doesn't like this that much. Instead, it likes the idea of king to h1, and then if h4 from black, simply going h3, stopping that alpha 0 pawn in its tracks, and white can always go rook g1, covering the g file if needed. So that would be the so-called strongest defense according to the engine. But instead here, b5 on the board for Arjun. Now here, Magnus, he continues h4, threatening h3, and if it gets h3 on the board, queen takes g2 would be a checkmate threat. All right, here, Arjun, b6 on the board, and Magnus, c takes b6, then bishop takes b6 for Arjun, a good choice. If instead you went a takes b6, that would clog up the queen side. You wouldn't really have a good open file to attack with, therefore bishop takes b6, definitely the right idea. Now here, Magnus, rook a to c8, guarding that c file. Arjun does go c5. That is the key idea. It's the only pawn break on the queen side. And now, very importantly, if Arjun takes on c5 with the pawn, d takes c5. At first glance, it looks like that would be okay for black. That pawn is defended twice and being attacked twice. Therefore, technically, it is a free pawn at first glance. However, white would have the idea, after d takes c5, simply d6, pushing back that bishop to say f6 or d8, then you could regain that pawn on c5, and you would have excellent attacking chances with that passed pawn on d6. So, d takes c5 would not be a good idea for Magnus. With that in mind, he simply continues the attack on the king side. The move, of course, is the alpha 0 move h3, and now here, Magnus, he is threatening checkmate in one move on g2, the audacity. Here, Arjun, he has to find a way to stop that threat. Now, there are a couple of ideas. You can go g3, for example. You could also go, say, queen to e2, or my favorite move here, rook to a2, defending with the rook and activating the rook on the second rank. That'd be a very creative idea. But in the game, instead, Arjun does go g3, perhaps the simplest option here. Now, in this position so far, Arjun is defending very, very well. He has that kingside locked down. However, Magnus Carlsen, here he finds a way to transition into a very good endgame scenario. Here he simply trades on e4 twice. So, bishop takes e4, then queen takes for Arjun, then queen takes and f takes e4, and now we do have an endgame on the board, and we will do inventory in just one moment, don't worry. Here, Magnus, he does take on c5, immediately d takes c5, that of course being perhaps the strongest idea here. And now Arjun does trade rooks. Rook takes f8, then king takes f8, and then king to f2. And here, real fast, let's do inventory. In this position, Magnus Carlsen, he does have that 4 versus 3 pawn majority in the center / the queen side. That will give him an advantage in this game. Beyond that, both sides have the bishops and the rooks. So overall, Magnus will have decent winning chances here. But can Magnus pull off a decisive victory, or will Arjun be able to defend in this endgame? Let's find out. Here, Magnus, he starts c4, gaining space on the queen side with that passed pawn. Passed pawns must be pushed, and that is the right idea in this position. Now here, Arjun, king to e2, bringing his king over to the defense. Now Magnus, bishop c5, trying to get those bishops off the board, a very good idea. And now here, Arjun, he simply has to go bishop takes c5, and then king d2. That is the right defense. However, instead in the game, he does go rook b1, defending on b6 with the rook. His idea being he wants to go rook takes b6 in response to bishop takes b6. However, it turns out this is a very serious mistake, and Magnus, he knows taking on b6 is not the right idea. The rook would be too active there. Instead, he just goes c3, pushing that pawn one square forward, and at first glance, it looks like that pawn is being suicided on the c3 square. After all, king d3 virtually stops that pawn in its tracks. However, here, Magnus, he has a big idea in mind. Here, bishop takes b6 is the move for Magnus. This forces a takes b6. After all, if you take with the rook instead, then c2, and that pawn cannot be stopped. The king can't stop it. c1 would promote, and beyond that, if you try to go rook b1 defending along the back rank, then of course c takes b1 would win the rook and you get a new queen on the spot. Therefore, a takes b6 is forced here, and now Magnus, c2, pushing the pawn once again. What is his idea? Well, the truth is, he wants to transition to a winning king and pawn endgame. He's calculated literally everything out from here. He knows black is simply winning on the spot. Here's how it works. Rook c1, then king to e7 for Magnus. Now here, Arjun, he simply has to capture that pawn on c2. Rook takes, king takes on the board. And now we do have a king and pawn endgame. The key factor being those passed pawns on d5 and a6. However, Magnus, his king, is very, very close to winning that pawn on b6. He will win that pawn. He will be up a pawn and have 2 passed pawns on the queen side. And as we're going to see, those pawns will be a very powerful asset. All right, king d6, king b3, king c5, g4, g5. Magnus locking down the king side, not allowing g6, g7 ideas. Now king to c3 and king takes b6. Now, this is technically a winning position for Magnus. Of course, he will have to follow up precisely to get the win against Arjun, but Magnus being the greatest endgame player of all time, that is certainly within his grasp. All right, here, king b4 for Arjun, then a5 knocks back the king to c4, and king to c7 for Magnus. Magnus Carlsen, his idea, he wants to slowly push those pawns down the board as far as they can go. So, for example, a6, then at some point a4 and b5 and so on. And the idea being, in the future, the king will not be able to capture that backward pawn, that one being on the b file, for example, and I'm going to explain why as we go along. All right, king b5, b6, then king to a4, and here Magnus, instead of going king to d6 immediately, he actually goes king d7. Here's the idea. King d7, this does allow the move king b5 for Arjun, but now king d6, and very, very importantly, in this position, that pawn on b6, technically it is hanging, but you cannot take it. If king takes b6, then the move for Magnus will be a4. The king will be outside of the square of the pawn. The king will have no way of getting back into the square, and that means the pawn will push down the board, and it will promote uncontested. Therefore, king takes b6 is not a possibility, so the king must go back. So, king to c4 in the game, and now Magnus, a4, pushing the pawn, the idea being he wants to go b5 next. And again, the king will not be able to capture on b5 as the a pawn is too far advanced, it would promote. So here Magnus, he is just slowly but surely pushing those pawns down the board. All right, king b4, then b5. Again, king takes b5, not possible as a3 would promote. The pawn is too fast. So king to a3, then king c5. Magnus here, he has to be very, very careful. He has to keep his king inside the square of this pawn on d5. If it goes down to, say, c4 too quickly, then d6 will threaten to promote. Therefore, Magnus, he must get his pawns on the queen side as far advanced as possible, and then the very last second, commit his king, allowing d6 from white, but knowing he can push his pawns down faster than the white pawn can promote on the d-file. All right, king b2, b4 for Magnus, king c2, b3, king c3, and then king to b5. The king's still in the square of the pawn, therefore that pawn cannot go yet. All right, here, Arjun, king d2 defending, then a3 from Magnus, king c3, then a2. Now, again, king takes b3 is not possible. a1 would promote. Therefore, king b2 is the move. And here, Magnus, he simply cannot wait any longer. There's nothing he can do without pushing his king down to the b4 or c4 squares. And of course, when he does that, he is allowing that pawn to promote on the d8 square. Therefore, he has to calculate everything out precisely. Here it goes. King to c4 on the board. The committal move. Now Arjun, d6. That pawn is a goner. It will promote. However, Magnus, he's not slowing down. He simply goes king d3. And here in this position, Arjun did resign to Magnus. But I want to show you why. I want to show you the full finish. Here, Arjun, the move, of course, would be d7, pushing the pawn one square further, threatening to promote on d8. However, Magnus, the move is a1, promoting to a queen. This does deflect the queen to a1. King takes a1 is the move. Then Magnus would go king c2, threatening b2, then b1. Here, Arjun would have the option of promoting. d8 promotes to a queen, but then Magnus, the finishing blow. b2 forces king to a2, then b1 queen forces king to a3, and then the final move of the game would be queen b3 checkmate. Therefore, for that reason, in this position right here, Arjun Erigaisi, after king d3 from Magnus, he did resign on the spot. He also calculated everything out. He saw that forced checkmate in roughly 5 moves. Therefore, he had enough, and he resigned to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game by Arjun Erigaisi and Magnus Carlsen in the 2024 FIDE World Rapid Team Championships. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button. And check out this video right here, where Arjun Erigaisi plays an absolutely diabolical attacking game in the Italian Opening as black. That game just happened in the 2024 Chennai Grand Masters Tournament. If you like Arjun Erigaisi, make sure you check out that video. It was incredible. And I'll see you in the next video.